Facebook has been accused of employing a systematic strategy to eliminate its competition. The US Federal Trade Commission says the social media giant has broken competition laws by suppressing innovation, cutting privacy protections for users and monetizing data. The FTC demands that Facebook's domination of the social media landscape comes to an end, and they should start by selling WhatsApp and Instagram. Well, joining me now is the Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics, Sam Bowman. Does Facebook actively seek to crush its competition?
I think it probably does to do that, but I think it fails to do so. Most businesses try to crush their competition by competing with them. And I think a much more simple and straightforward explanation of what Facebook has been doing is that it's trying to compete with lots of other firms. There's a contradiction at the heart of the complaints that have been brought, which is that if Facebook was a competitor of Instagrams and WhatsApps, and those are all quite different services, then it means that Facebook must also be a competitor of services like Twitter, TikTok, Twitch, YouTube, all of the other sites that offer similar but not identical functionality. So either Facebook is a monopolist in a very narrow market, in which case the acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp would not be problematic, or it's a participant in a much broader market in which Facebook is a player, Instagram is a player, and all these other sites are players as well. And I think that latter case is much more kind of likely and a much more sensible reading of the data. But unfortunately, it means that the FTC and the State Attorney General's case doesn't really stack up.
And yet the case is that instead of competing in the marketplace with their rivals, Facebook looks to buy them, swallow them up. And if they don't do that, they seek to clone their products. And that reduces consumer choice.
Well, cloning products doesn't reduce consumer choice. Cloning products increases consumer choice. But remember that when Facebook bought Instagram, it paid $1 billion for it. And at the time, virtually everybody thought that was an insane overpayment. At the time, in 2012, Instagram was a photo filtering app that had a kind of social media dimension. It had 24 million users. It now has 1 billion users, and it's one of the most valuable social media properties on Earth. It's very, very, very difficult to see why Facebook could get away with paying so little, 1 billion, for a service that was predestined to become as successful as Instagram has become. I think what's much more likely, and I think what fits with what everybody was saying at the time, was that Facebook bought a fairly interesting, but not that interesting site and built it into what it is today. Facebook invested huge amounts in Instagram. I think they got very lucky. I think that lots of the decisions that were made by Facebook's management about how to run Instagram, a really good example is one you've just mentioned, copying stories from Snapchat. All of these decisions and all of this investment helped to make Instagram what it is today. Now, if that's true, that means that Facebook is the contributor and one of the major causes of Instagram's success. And it doesn't, it means that if anything, really Facebook's acquisition of Instagram has been pro-competitive because it's created another option in the market for consumers. Only if you think that Instagram was destined to turn into what it has become today, could you imagine that acquisition was anti-competitive? And in that case, you have to explain why Instagram was bought for such a tiny amount of money that even at the time people thought was insanely high amount of money to pay.
I mean, Facebook says that the deals under scrutiny, that of WhatsApp and Instagram, were approved by the regulators years ago. But that doesn't mean the regulators shouldn't then look at it again in the light of new evidence, does it?
I think that's right. I mean, you can see why Facebook is annoyed. These deals were scrutinized and they were cleared. But I think from a competition point of view, we should be quite relaxed about competition authorities and agencies being willing to look over their past decisions and in some cases reverse them if they have found anti-competitive behavior. In fact, it's one of the reasons that we should be more relaxed about allowing firms to acquire other firms today. If we know that later on in future, we can come back and review that decision if it turns out things haven't gone well. And there's a real risk of throwing the baby with the bathwater and worrying that every acquisition by an Amazon or a Google is going to be competitive. Because what that does is it deprives users of those services of potentially valuable new kind of services that could be integrated. It means that startups are going to find it much more difficult to actually make money, and entrepreneurs are going to find it much more difficult to raise investment because they have nobody to sell to. And it means that ultimately we might be banning a lot of very pro-competitive acquisitions that really could be good for users.
But this is about power and influence, isn't it? And at the heart of this is whether big tech is actually just getting too big.
Well, I don't think that competition policy or antitrust should be about political ends. I think competition and antitrust should be about consumer welfare. I think they should be about our consumers getting as much choice as possible, our prices being driven down as low as possible, and as innovation being maximized as much as possible. To me, those are the things that competition is about. There is certainly a role for politicians to think about the political impact of big companies. I don't actually have a view about that, and I think that's something that people should debate, and politicians should decide for themselves. I don't think that's an antitrust or a competition question. And I think that we'd be doing consumers a great disservice if we try to use competition or antitrust as a Swiss Army knife to solve all the other problems that we see in the world.
Sam Bowman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's take a look.